二人っきりで話したいなんてどういう関係だ？
ディープな関係らしいぜ。
昔の男が？
お似合いのカップルだ。
めちゃめちゃ元気そうね、弁護士さん。
太ってるからが偏見だな。
説明してほしいわ。
死亡注入したんだ。あの事故の後、この脇の下あたりを切ってここから。
そうじゃない。
3年ぶりか。君が元気そうでよかった。
よく言うわよ。
Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. Nice to see you all again. This is part 3 in this 4-part series based on episode 15 of Cowboy Bebop. So, let's get stuck in.
二人っきりで話したいなんてどういう関係だ？
ディープな関係らしいぜ。
昔の男が？
お似合いのカップルだ。
二人っきりで話したいなんてどういう関係だ？
ディープな関係らしいぜ。
昔の男が？
お似合いのカップルだ。
Look at the amount of English, arguably relatively pointless English, in this short exchange between Spike and Jet. Deep na kanki rashize, oniai no kappuru. Does Japanese not have a word for deep? Does it not have a word for couple, pair of people, romantic couple, romantically attached couple? Actually, I can't think of one apart from kappuru, but that's another problem. Kappuru to one side, this is the only place I can think of that I've ever heard a Japanese person say deepu. Now obviously all languages pick up words from other languages. That is something that has always happened and that will undoubtedly always happen. That said, there are two things that seem to me to be probably undeniable, though I'm open to being corrected. Observation number one is that English is probably unique in the early 21st century, at least in terms of its ability to penetrate other languages and its degree of penetration of other languages. Observation two is that Japanese is almost uniquely open to being penetrated by English. The Japanese are very willing and eager to just suck up insane numbers of English words for no apparent reason at all. I mean, sometimes they have a reason. Internetto, okay, there was no native Japanese word for that. But diipu, kappuru, I mean, really? This influx of English words into Japanese is so fast and furious that it's not at all obvious, at least to me, and I don't imagine it's obvious to the Japanese either, which of these words have really thoroughly embedded themselves in the language and which English loanwords are just skimming across the surface, being used by a few people today only to be gone tomorrow. As you go on studying Japanese, I think that sooner or later you will come to realize that you are not at all certain which English words or English loanwords have what sort of status in Japanese. So you have English words that will be used occasionally in Japanese by some Japanese people, but they may be relatively niche items that most people would not understand. You have English words that perhaps haven't been in Japanese for 100 years or anything like that, but that nonetheless are fairly deeply embedded and that will be recognized and understood by most Japanese people. And then you have other words that have penetrated so deeply that they just seem almost as Japanese as any other word in the language now, I imagine. I'm talking about words that hardly seem like loanwords at all. If you're a native speaker of English, and you probably are if you're watching this video, what would it take to make you start using the word fukai instead of the word deep in English? If you were talking about a well in your back garden, what would it take to make you say that it was fukai rather than deep? Whoa, it's really fukai, man. That's crazy. What would it take to make you do that despite the fact that we already have a word for that? Can you imagine doing that? There's something profoundly different about where Japanese people are psychologically with respect to their language and the way we are with respect to our language.
めちゃめちゃ元気そうね、弁護士さん。
太ってるからが偏見だな。
説明してほしいわ。めちゃめちゃ元気そうね、弁護士さん。
太ってるからが偏見だな。
説明してほしいわ。
This is a nice example of arguably one of the core problems in language learning, especially when you're learning a language that's very alien with respect to your own. The problem I'm talking about is what appears to be a wild and crazy scrambling of a word or a semantic chunk, if you like, that seems to be nice and coherent in our own language. The semantic chunk that I'm talking about here is the word want, or the verb to want, if you like. What a nice simple word that is in English. It expresses such a nice simple concept in such a nice simple fashion. I want beer. That's I want noun, right? I want to go home. I want, and then the infinitive with to. The infinitive isn't always used with to, but here it is. I want him to speak French. Here you have I want plus an object plus the infinitive with to again. So different structures, but they're all related, right? All these concepts are related. They're all to do with wanting something. So why do the Japanese have to muck this up? Biru ga hoshii. Noun, ga, normally here, and then hoshii, which is an e adjective. Watashi wa kaeritai. This is just the Thai form. There's no independent word here that matches the English word to want at all. Furansugo de shabette hoshii. Now we have the te form and we have hoshii, so there's some kind of overlap here with the first item in the sense that we use the word hoshii, but the way in which it's incorporated into the sentence is quite different, isn't it? That seems to make this a bit awkward. And then you can also say Furansugo de shabette moraitai or Furansugo de shabette itadakitai. So now we've actually put the Thai form back in, but the core action here, the speaking in French, isn't what we're attaching it to. We want to receive the favour of somebody else speaking French is what we're saying. The Japanese here seems awkward to us, at least in the beginning. It's not awkward obviously once you got the hang of it. Once you got the hang of it you think, oh, why doesn't English have something like a Thai form? That seems straightforward. But in the beginning, yeah, it's difficult to get the hang of this stuff. If you are a native speaker of English, or for that matter just about any other European language I would say, then in the early stages of learning Japanese, your brain is going to funnel its activity here through the English word want. And that is going to create problems because you're going to start looking for something that matches it and it's not necessarily going to be there. This might surprise you, but learning to say things like, I want him to speak French is a major stumbling block for many people who have to learn English as a foreign language. And I'm not just talking about Japanese people or Chinese people. I'm talking about people who speak other European languages. Lots of people want to say something like, I want that he speaks French, because that's the way they do it in their language. It's very difficult to get people to stop doing this. You just have to learn, getting back to Japanese, you just have to learn that I want to go and I want him to go are expressed very differently in Japanese.
死亡注入したんだ。あの事故の後、この脇の下あたりを切ってここから。
そうじゃない。
死亡注入したんだ。あの事故の後、この脇の下あたりを切ってここから。
そうじゃない。
This is a nice example of the explanatory that. This is all over the place in Japanese. I can't pick out every single example of it. I just quite like this one and I thought we could look at it for a moment. 脂肪注入したんだ. So this means fat injection. This isn't in my active vocabulary, although it's kind of obvious what it means, I suppose. So why does he add the nda onto the end of it? Why doesn't he just say 脂肪注入した? Well, as a general principle, nda or not da, because the is just no, right? It's a type of contraction. This structure is used to refer to something else. It's not a flat, neutral, uncoloured statement. It refers back to something else that is already understood by the listener and the speaker for that matter. And that's where this nda gets its explanatory nature from. So Faye has already said to this guy, oh, you're looking well, because he's obviously a lot chubbier than he used to be, right? She's saying, oh, you're looking well. And he says, yeah, I got fat injections. That's why I look like this. It's explanatory, right? It's referring back to what she's just said. It's really not very easy to figure out where you should use this structure and where you shouldn't use it. Over time, your understanding of this will improve, but I still notice that sometimes I hear it when I wouldn't expect to hear it, and sometimes I don't hear it where I would expect to hear it when I listen to Japanese, which means that my understanding of it is obviously less than perfect. If you're already at some sort of stage where you're already speaking Japanese, ask yourself, do I use it? Where do I use it? Why do I use it? Do I understand what it's doing? Or do I just kind of use it sometimes because I think maybe I should? It's interesting. Just step back and ask yourself what you're doing here. You'll probably find it very difficult to rationalize exactly what it does. Even if you understand it to some extent, it'll still be difficult to rationalize.
3年ぶりか。君が元気そうでよかった。
よく言うわよ。
3年ぶりか。 君が元気そうでよかった。
よく言うわよ。
It's easy to think that when you learn a foreign language, you have to learn the grammar, and you have to learn a load of vocabulary, and then you can shove the vocabulary into the grammar, so to speak, and then you can more or less say whatever you want to say. I mean, that's how languages work, right? Well, in some sense it is, but it's actually a hell of a lot more complicated than that. What do I mean? Well, let's look at what Faye says here. So here Faye says, and I wouldn't say it like this because I'm a man and she's a woman, but she says, yoku yu ayo. Now, if you ignore the wa and the yo, which are emphatic particles, you get yoku yu, but doesn't that just mean someone says something well? Now, she's talking about the guy she's talking to. He's the subject here, not her. That's clear if you know what this means, but just take my word for it for now. So, what's she saying? You say well. What's that supposed to mean? Well, he's just said to her that it's nice to see that she's looking so well. But that's kind of rich coming from a guy who faked his own death when they were in a relationship together to get her to take on all his debts. You have to watch the entire episode to understand what I'm talking about, but that's what happened. So he says, hey, you're looking well. And she says to him, well, what does she say? You say well? What she's saying is basically, that's pretty rich coming from you. You've got a lot of nerve saying that. You've got some cheek saying that to me. Look at my translations here. Rich, nerve, cheek. None of these words are there in the Japanese. You can't translate this stuff directly. The word yoku, sometimes yokumo. Sometimes you'll see a mo in there too, depending on the context. It's used to speak judgmentally about someone's behavior. You've got a lot of nerve doing that. How dare you do that? You've got some cheek doing that. How do I know that? Well, because I spent a long time studying Japanese and I'm quite good at it, and my brain somehow just picked up over the years that that's what that means when you say that kind of thing. You can't understand it directly or literally. Maybe someone explained it to me, maybe I asked someone. This is all 20 years ago or more, I don't remember, but my brain picked it up. And when I translate that into English, I don't care about the direct translation. I pick that chunk of the English language that expresses what Faye is expressing. To speak Japanese well, again this would be true of any other language, but we're talking about Japanese. To speak Japanese well, you have to do lots of things correctly, but one of the things that you have to do is acquire hundreds, thousands of these little chunks of language. You have to acquire them on their own terms. You have to understand what the Japanese actually mean when they say them, and eventually you have to learn to produce them when you speak Japanese, and that is hard and it takes a long time. And this is one of the reasons that sometimes, this is probably the main reason, that sometimes we encounter things in a foreign language. We seem to understand all the words, we seem to understand the grammar, and yet we have no idea what they're talking about. This happens a lot, and this is the main reason why. There is a convention in the Japanese language which dictates that this kind of thing has a certain meaning, but you can't see that. You have to learn it as a chunk. If you take an English expression like, get on with it, we know what that means. But would a Japanese person who knew the four words get on with and it be able to figure out what it meant? So that's it for today. Thanks very much for listening. As always, I hope that was useful and maybe even interesting. I will see you next time. Thank you. Bye bye. Ciao ciao.